we're now looking at the invisible hand, and I guess you're not afraid of some theory and concepts that can underlie the motivations for sustainability. So we're going to look at, for example, self-interest in this lecture. We're going to look at the addiction or maximization of comfort, certainly the desire for profit, and really the understanding that people are wanting to be secure and not running out of the resources and money that they need. So we got to go a little bit deeper and understand what's at the root of it's all about the money. Why do we always say that, and is it really true? Economics is a discipline that deals with how we value and perceive our environment. So they're obviously connected, right? And that drives the way we behave, not only the way we think, but the things that we actually do on a daily basis. So economics studies how people use resources in the face of supply and demand. Sounds boring, but it's actually pretty critical for what we're going to be talking about today. So for example, we understand that most environmental and economic problems are linked directly, and they really can't be separated, and we're going to show you plenty of examples of that today. And certainly the root eco gave rise to both ecology and economics. This is not a surprise to any of you, but I think needs to be said. I like the term the invisible hand because it sets up a term that I'm going to use later in the lectures, which is the second invisible hand. Sounds pretty clever. Adam Smith in 1776 writes The Wealth of Nations that has a huge impact on the future of humanity, at least in the US and in Western countries. And his idea was very sound. Competition between people free to pursue their own economic interests will benefit society as a whole. That sounds pretty interesting. So if I maximize my profit and I do good for myself, somehow the rest of society will benefit. The caveat, though, is that I have to assume a rule of law, private property, and competitive markets. And we know how difficult that has been over the course of history to actually do. So the idea itself that Adam Smith came up with is fundamentally really powerful and has actually formed some of the basis for the Industrial Revolution. However, there are many problems that come along with that we're going to look at here. So for example, Smith was trying to resolve the direct benefits of action for profit with the indirect benefits of good for society. I think fundamentally that's a great idea. I go out and maximize profit and I do good for myself and somehow society benefits. I don't know if it's idealistic or if it's real, but let's talk about it a little bit more. Really, this did form what we call the idea, this is really a pillar of the free market capitalism today. Go out and make your way, and somehow the rest of the wealth will trickle down or benefit others, or somehow the environment will be fine, because he says assume rule of law, right? So if we have laws that protect the environment, we're in good shape. However, this also is blamed for lots of economic inequality in a capitalist system. In fact, some would argue that capitalism relies on economic inequality to get cheap labor. So this is certainly by no means presented as a perfect system, but there is some power here that needs to be understood in terms of how we can harness this kinds of ideas for sustainability. So here's where the real problem that I find in the free market is, the assumptions. Resources are infinite or substitutable. Maybe, maybe not, but worries me that, let's do whatever we want today because tomorrow we can figure out something better. We always have a better technology. We'll always find more resources. So let's keep maximizing profits. Long-term effects are discounted or considered externalities, which the government must deal with. This is a really fundamental problem of the free market, right? I'm going to go out and maximize profit. I'm going to pollute the planet. It's going to be up to the taxpayers and the government to clean up that mess. So it's not a closed-loop system. Later in the course, we're going to be talking about open-loop and closed-loop systems. But today, we know this is an open-loop system that has led to a lot of environmental destruction. And the other problem that I have is costs and benefits are internal. So it's a really kind of closed equation that really drives how people make decisions. And externalities are really not encountered when thinking about business models. This is a fundamental flaw, which led us to the point where sustainability has come into being, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And finally, probably in the most dangerous sense, from a sustainability point of view, growth is good. Now, what if we could harvest that idea of growth is good, but make growth sustainable growth? This is where I'm really optimistic about the free market because it moves really fast and it's very powerful. But we do know that each of these can contribute to environmental problems. So here's a little math problem. I'm not really very good at math, but maybe I'm okay at math. So if I take the number 27 and divide it by 4, my answer is 6, right? Because 4 goes into 27 6 times, and there's a remainder of 3. And when I think of externalities, I think of the idea of the remainder, of the equation that's not balanced, or the equation that's never solved. That remainder of 3 can take the form of all kinds of horrible things that we really don't want to deal with. So for example, if I look at externalities, I think about how they impact the planet Earth. So I think about, for example, a consumer economy where we're buying all these products, we're shopping, and these products are made of plastic, and there's nothing fundamentally evil about plastic. I'm not against plastic. But we do know that plastic has a huge set of externalities which find themselves in the oceans. So now we're seeing the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is just tons of plastic. That, oh, by the way, all of the local ecology, all the animals in the local ecologies in the ocean are eating this plastic and it's getting in their systems. You see, that's an externality. Another externality might be, for example, high temperatures. What do you mean? How could that be an externality from the pursuit of profit? Well, if in my pursuit of profit I'm emitting carbon into the atmosphere at record rates, and that carbon is a greenhouse gas which is actually impacting the total ecosystem of the planet, which is causing temperatures to rise. In fact, so much here in Australia that they had a new color to the map to do that. But also in terms of crazy weather. Right now it's very cold in Philadelphia and people are saying global warming, ha ha ha, right? Well, others would argue, and scientists have been discussing the idea that climate change and extreme weather is in fact an example of the externalities that are generated when we emit carbon into the atmosphere. So sustainability clearly has a lot to do with that, and certainly the free market deals with how we get goods from our environment, right? So for example, we can think about the planet as the commons, as those things that are shared, the environment. The temperature is something that we share, right? We can't buy temperature. Well, we can buy heating and cooling, but we can't buy the temperature of the planet, right? It's a common. There's all kinds of commons. We also use the term ecosystem services to reflect the commons. So soil and soil health is something that we need to survive going forward. Water purification, climate regulation is a common, right? We want to regulate the climate to protect the commons. Bee pollination, and some of you are worried about bees going extinct. Well, that would only be 25 to 30% of all of our fruits and vegetables rely on pollination. These are commons. And certainly nutrient cycling and waste treatment. All of these things nature does for us as humans that we benefit from. So ecosystem services can be expressed in monetary terms, but not very easily. And it also can be expressed in terms of carrying capacity. And this is really at the crux of sustainability. Many people worry that we've exceeded the ability of the earth to carry us forward into the future with the quality of life that we have now. So we call that carrying capacity. We also know that nature or the commons has huge scientific value, and we worry about deforestation. We know that educational value exists, aesthetic value. We go to the beach, to the mountains. We love to take in nature and enjoy it. And certainly for many cultures, nature has an intrinsic value. So we could talk about the tragedy of the commons, which is this idea that self-interest actually doesn't work. This is, by the way, a theory that was developed by Garrett Hardin. But what he's saying here, if you want to read those words right there, is if we all try to maximize our profit by sharing the same resources, eventually those resources will be so depleted that we can no longer make a profit. You see the problem here? So the tragedy of the commons is really a famous story that we use here in sustainability to talk about, maybe self-interest doesn't really work in the long term, and maybe we have to find some other models that can work. So we got to protect the commons, which is really at the heart of what we're talking about here today. And this is not a unique concept. The UN has been working on this for years and years and years. And as you know, sustainability is actually a concept that emerged from the UN. Here we're looking at the Rio Plus 20 work that's been done. And it's really interesting because it talks about the commons at a global level. So for example, you can see up here, there's an environmental ceiling. And we have things like climate change, water, nitrogen, ocean acidification, which is a critical element, by the way. And what the UN is doing is they're mapping whether we've exceeded the environmental ceiling of our commons. And they find 3 places where we've gone over the ceiling. Climate change, so you look at climate change here, we've gone over. We've had a problem with our nitrogen cycle, and finally, loss of biodiversity. So what can we begin to do here? We can begin to think about carbon neutral design as a way to think about the commons. We can begin to think about how food is grown, not just in farms, but also on site, inside buildings, to find a more integrated model. And certainly we can begin to think about how we choose materials and how we transport those materials and where we get them from as a response to biodiversity. So we're just beginning to talk about sustainability in a very broad sense. And we're ending our lecture on the invisible hand, and we're going to start talking about how we can manage the commons through different strategies and operations.